say that broadcast of City Club programs this quarter is made possible in part by corporate underwriting from Pacific Care, Portland General Electric, Zimmer Gunsel Frasca, and we're extremely grateful for their support. I'd like to mention, too, if you would be good enough to turn off your cell phones and other electronic devices so that we won't interrupt our speaker, who is Alan Durning, and he founded the Northwest Environment Watch in 1993. Prior to that, he was a senior researcher at World Watch Institute in Washington, D.C. He studied and wrote about the relationships between social and environmental issues. He's a prolific author of books and articles related to sustainability and its relationship to the economy. His articles have been published in the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, New York Times, International Herald Tribune, among many others, more than 100 others, in fact. And he has spoken at the White House, major universities, and numerous conferences. If his voice sounds familiar, it's because he does radio commentary for NPR's Living on Earth. He graduated with high honors from Oberlin College in Ohio, and he lives in Seattle, which is his hometown, with his wife and 3 children. Alan, welcome.
Thank you, Corleen. Is the sound system such that you guys can hear me way in the back? Okay, and you out there in Radio Land, can you hear me? Well, I can't hear their response. I've been looking forward to this day, July 9th, to speak at City Club. My dad did about 30 years ago, he was telling me recently. And so finally, I've always had this complex because my dad's kind of an overachiever. At last, I've achieved parity, so now I can relax for the rest of my life. I've spoken to City Club. Oh, I guess I should have to finish the speech. I also want to congratulate all of you on surviving the 4th of July. It's an important holiday in which we celebrate our independence and freedom, but it's a rather peculiar way that we observe the holiday. We send millions of dollars to China to buy exploding devices, which we then use to terrorize all the dogs in our neighborhood. A strange thing to do. Nonetheless, we've survived. My neighborhood has finally quieted down, no longer explosions in the middle of the night. Before I make my remarks, I want to thank all of you for coming. Also, Tim Kraus at City Club, who did all the legwork to get this going. Bill Kramer from the City Club board, who suggested that I be invited. I want to thank Corleen for that warm introduction. I also want to thank Marcus for what is going to be a very gentle and loving first question when he asks it after I drone on for a few minutes here. I also need to ask your indulgence while I thank some people who are in attendance. A number of volunteers and members of Northwest Environment Watch are in the audience, and I want to thank all of you for your help with the work that I'll be describing in the next 30 minutes or so. Of special note are folks at a table here to the front who are all heavily invested in the organization and have been part of the backbone of our work, in some cases for many years. We deeply appreciate the support that you have given to us. All right, here we go. As a society, we are obsessed not only with torturing dogs on the 4th of July, but also with measurement. From the Dow Jones Industrial Average to the Consumer Confidence Index, the Consumer Price Index, and the GDP, the Purchasing Manager's Inventory Report, the educational tests that we report on to parents of children, the sports scores, box scores, especially baseball. Baseball people are fanatics about measurement. Entertainment as well. Box office gross over the weekend is reported as if it's huge news. Did Spider-Man 2 top Spider-Man 1? Our own body weight, some of us, measure rather obsessively. But curiously, we do not measure, or we do not measure well, some of the most fundamental aspirations that we share as Northwesterners. The health and well-being of our families, the strength of our communities, the integrity of nature in our places. Consider some contrasts. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, which we take as kind of the main indicator of how American capitalism fared on any given day. is reported not only in the United States but around the world. It highlights the financial news. It's actually calculated every minute and reported online. And what is it? The Dow Jones Industrial Average is regarded by stock market insiders as sort of a joke. Created in 1897 by Charles Dow, the first editor of the Wall Street Journal, the Dow Jones Industrial Average simply averages the price of certain major corporations. The corporations that are included are chosen not by any objective methodology whatsoever, but by two employees of the Dow Jones Company who simply pick. Used to be there were 12 companies when Charles Dow started it. Now there are 30 companies. Periodically they change the companies. They don't rename the index, but they change the companies. And then what do? They look at simply the price of the shares of those companies, not the total market value of those companies, just the price of each share. That would be like adding up the money in your wallet by averaging the denominations without regard to how many 20s you had versus how many ones, right? A commentator in Money magazine said that the Dow Jones is about as effective an indicator of stock market performance as averaging the heights of the CEOs of those 30 companies. And yet, like the Romans reading the entrails of chickens, we pay homage each day to the Dow Jones Industrial Average as an indicator of how we're doing. But we do not measure how happy we are. Even suggesting it sounds kind of silly, doesn't it? Well, social scientists, psychologists, and sociologists and so on have actually done a tremendous amount of research and figured out ways that you can actually measure how content people are with their lives. And if you read the academic journals, you can find some trend data. And we find information that is almost shocking. During the period since 1957, when the Dow Jones Industrial Average has increased 10, if not 20-fold, the share of Americans who are very happy with their lives has stayed exactly the same. The same is true in many other countries. Above a certain point, additional growth in economic indicators is associated with no further increase in satisfaction with life. Another example, another contrast, the Consumer Confidence Index. Something we again hear about every month when it's reported in the financial pages and often in the news sections of our news and headlining some of our news broadcasts as well. What is it? Well, it's based on a survey. There are actually 3 competing versions of the Consumer Confidence Index, so some months you may hear 3 different results. The Consumer Confidence Index is based on a survey of consumers basically about whether they feel like spending. The variation month to month is usually less than the margin of error. In other words, the results that you're hearing on the news are completely irrelevant, right? There is no change that they can detect. Furthermore, studies after the fact show that the Consumer Confidence Index is a miserable predictor of how much spending people subsequently do, right? It's only marginally better than the entrails of chickens. And yet, we hear the Consumer Confidence Index, and it informs businesses' decisions about how much to spend. It informs governments' decisions about whether the economy is going up and they should focus on one thing, or whether it's going down and we should focus on others. But we do not measure, or we do not measure well, our intentions with respect to having children. The one study that's ever been conducted in the state of Oregon found that 38% of births in the state result from unplanned pregnancies, from accidents, moments of passion. 38%. Now we know that unplanned pregnancies are associated with a whole bunch of negative social outcomes for babies and for moms, for families, and over the long term for the welfare of children. But we've measured it exactly once in the state of Oregon. And if you wanted to find out an update, since that study was done several years ago, it would be impossible. The confidence of consumers, in other words, their intentions about spending, we track. Our intentions about whether we will bring a new life into the world are a mystery. A third contrast, consider the gross national product. This is the summum bonum of economic statistics, regarded by those in the know as the leading benchmark of how our economy is doing. It tells us whether we're in a recession or not. What is it? The gross national product is the sum of all spending on finished consumer goods and services. The sum of all spending. It's an excellent indicator of how much we're spending. And that's all it is. In fact, the Nobel Prize-winning economist Simon Kuznets, who invented the gross national product, warned repeatedly and vociferously against using the gross national product indicator as anything but a technical gauge of interest to academic economists and certain bankers about cash flow in the economy. Instead, we use it as essentially like the balance sheet. Imagine if we operated our businesses to maximize cash flow and not the net worth. Now, we can't, in fact, construct a balance sheet for our economy overall because we don't measure the fundamental assets that allow the money part of the economy to function. We don't measure the health of our communities, which allow business to happen by raising children and supporting workers. We do not measure the natural assets that allow the economy to function by providing air for those workers to breathe, and the consumers too. Consumer confidence would plummet without air. The water that they drink, the food that they eat, the protection from pollution, flood, pestilence, and all the other biblical maladies. What do we know about the natural asset base, the gross natural productivity that supports the GNP? Well, in the Northwest, we know that salmon, our totemic species, are not doing terribly well. A huge share of all the distinct populations of salmon, as you know, are listed as endangered or threatened, along with about 130 other species that are on official state and federal lists of endangered and threatened species. And actually, those lists, getting listed as a species is quite an accomplishment. It's like having, if you're the equivalent in pop culture terms would be getting your star in Hollywood. What is the street where they do that? Come on, guys. The big stars get Hollywood Boulevard. We're going to have a group over here who works out the answer to this question and get back to us. But you guys know what I'm talking about. To get your you have to be a pretty big deal on the endangered in terms of endangerment to actually get listed officially. Field biologists have an informal system of monitoring the well-being of species, and they find that roughly 10 times as many plant and animal types are in danger to one degree or another in our region. A fair bit then of the cash flow that's showing up in GNP is simply the liquidation of our assets. And yet, we largely run our economy to maximize GNP and consider it an afterthought to protect gross natural productivity and also the health and well-being of our communities and the culture that allows the GNP to survive. My larger point is this: if we don't measure what we value, we will end up valuing what we measure. And that, I would argue, is the situation that we are in. To help to rectify this imbalance, Northwest Environment Watch, the regional research center in Seattle that I direct, launched a project 3 years ago to create the Cascadia Scorecard, a regional gauge of progress that monitors 7 key trends shaping our region's future. It's not perfect, but it's a good start. It's a lot better than the existing scorecard that we operate, as limited as that is. I like to talk about the existing indicators that we use, things like GNP and the Dow, as like if you got a report card from school on your kid's performance, but only one of the grades was filled in. So we've been trying to fill in some of the other grades. We've got not enough time for me to tell you everything we found out in 3 years of research with the help of hundreds of volunteers and advisors, 40-odd experts, and the accumulated learning as reflected in the literature of thousands of people. I'm going to give a quick summary, but let me tell you first where you can get more information. For those of you here today for lunch at City Club, we have fact sheets on the back table, a few copies of the book, Cascadia Scorecard, that launches the new gauge. In addition, you can go to our website and there download the entire book as a PDF, as Marcus did. We like that just fine, though it does decrease our revenue because you're not buying the book from us. But you can think about, do you want to have an impact on GNP or not when you get the book, right? There's one mechanism where you can increase GNP and one where you have no effect whatsoever. In addition, you can find lots of cool animated maps, backup data, and other neat stuff. The website is cascadiascorecard.org. In addition, there you can sign up for monthly updates, what's the newest things we are finding about the website, and you'll be informed when the annual updates come out. For those of you here in the room, we have a sign-up sheet, I believe at the back table over there, where you can put down your name and an email address, and we will sign you up for that information. Let me give you a summary now of the Cascadia Scorecard. As I said, 7 trends. The first is health. The best single measure of health is how long we live, lifespan. It tells us ultimately about all forms of illness and death, or at least most forms of illness and all forms of death. When we measure the Pacific Northwest, on this particular indicator, we find that we are a pretty healthy place. If we were an independent nation, that is the Cascadia region of British Columbia, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, we would be the 8th healthiest in the world. A baby born last year in the Northwest could be expected to live for 79 years. That has been growing steadily for a century. A baby born today can be expected to live about 3 hours longer than a baby born yesterday. As an annual pace of change, this is about it's about 0.2%. Not a rapid rate of increase, but over the last century, this change has been probably the most significant that our continent has seen. The 30-year increase in lifespan that we've experienced in North America since 1900 is a larger increase than that measured between the dawn of agriculture and 1900. Oregon trails the rest of the Northwest slightly on this indicator, lagging behind British Columbia by 2 full years. So those in the know, when they reach 79, may want to move into Canada. Indicator number 2 is economy. Economy is an important thing to measure. The prevailing indicators largely reflect the aggregate performance of the economy. We felt it was important to measure how the economy was working for ordinary residents of the region. How are folks at the middle of the income ladder doing? How are folks in the bottom half of the income ladder doing? Measured in this way with a composite indicator of median incomes, unemployment rates, and poverty, we find that ordinary Northwesterners are doing not too bad by world standards. But since 1999, as you might expect, the region has skidded. Oregon has done worst in the most recent period. What's most interesting is that when we look for the current recession cycle, in the indicators that show how ordinary residents of the region are doing, the recession starts in about 1996, and we haven't come out of it yet. If you look at the aggregate indicators of performance, the recession starts in 2001. We would operate our policymaking, our economic policymaking differently if we looked at the Cascadia Scorecard's indicator of how the economy is functioning. Indicator number 3, population. This is important environmentally, of course, in terms of the aggregate burden that we place on ecosystems, but it is as or more important as an indicator of the conditions for our families. The indicator that we're looking at, well, we'll put it this way. Around the world, we know that as economic and educational opportunities for women improve, women choose to have smaller families and to have them later in life. Not just women, but men as well. don't want to make half the audience feel left out. But, you know, end of the day, women have more control over it. So, what we've looked at is an indicator that shows average family size and the timing. Are women choosing to have smaller families later in life? Where that's happening, we know that reflects improvements in the conditions of life for women, especially for poor women and for young women, because those are the categories that make the biggest difference on this indicator. When we look at this one, we find that the Northwest is doing not too bad. We're doing substantially better than the rest of North America. Average family size is 1.8 births per woman of reproductive age. Best in the world is about 1.7 in Northern Europe. But we've been stuck at about 1.8 for about the last 20-some years since the baby boom. So we're not seeing the kind of improvement that we would hope for. Oregon has a lot of room for improvement, in particular on this indicator compared to other parts of the Northwest. Oregon has 3 times the teen birth rate of British Columbia and about 5 to 10 times the teen birth rate in Northern European countries. As I mentioned before, about more than 1/3 of births in the state of Oregon are the result of unplanned pregnancies. Indicator number 4, energy. Energy probably wouldn't pop up on most people's list of what are the most important things for us to measure in terms of my quality of life, but it turns out that it is a root cause of all kinds of challenges that we face, and it's a window of opportunity for some dramatic improvements in our economy, because fossil fuels are our region's largest economic import, draining tens of millions of dollars out of the regional economy each year. Secondly, because the price volatility of the energy that we consume is a huge vulnerability of our economy that affects especially ordinary residents of the region, those in the middle and bottom half of the income ladder. And third, because energy is the single most important form of consumption when we look at environmental consequences, whether we're looking at global climate change or the survival of salmon and the well-being of our aquatic ecosystems. Looking at this indicator, we see per capita consumption of energy down slightly since '98, probably because of the recession mostly, but still pretty much staying at the high plateau it's been since the early 1970s. This is an indicator that goes up till about 1970, then oscillates up and down up to the present. What's happening is that all the improvement we've been making in energy efficiency is being exactly balanced out by expansion of our appetites. The engines in our vehicles are more efficient at converting every ounce of fuel, or gram of fuel if you prefer metric, into horsepower, but our vehicles are getting bigger and more powerful. They go 0 to 60 more quickly. Same for our buildings. Our buildings are getting more efficient at heating and cooling and lighting each square foot, but we're adding square feet. And those two factors are exactly balancing each other out. So the Northwest, though we have a reputation as being real pioneers on energy issues, doesn't stack up that well. Our energy consumption per person is dramatically higher than in California or New York. In fact, we're almost as high as residents of the state of Texas. Best in the world performance on this indicator is in Germany, where Germans consume per person about 40% as much non-renewable energy as we in the Northwest. At current rates of progress in our region, it would take us about 86 years to catch up with where Germany was 2 years ago. Indicator number 5, sprawl. In our region, sprawl overruns about 2 acres of land every hour, 2 acres of open space every hour. Again, it might not rank in the average person on the streets list of the 7 most important trends of how we're doing, but again, as for energy, it's a root cause of many of the biggest challenges that we face, whether you're talking about traffic congestion, whether we're talking about economic vitality, whether we're talking about air quality, whether we're talking about human health. The decisions we make about urban form ultimately determine all kinds of the other variables that we care about. Smart growth is gaining in our cities, in fact, in every one of the 7 major metropolitan areas that we have monitored in the Cascadia Scorecard, including the Eugene area, the Portland-Salem greater metropolitan area, in Oregon, along with Boise, Spokane, Greater Seattle, Victoria, and Vancouver in British Columbia. But the improvements have been very slow. We have about 28% of residents in these 7 metropolitan areas living in compact, walkable neighborhoods, the kind of places where bus service can work and you can walk at least to one or two shops. Though we're not talking here about the Pearl District. We're talking instead about sort of more of the central area of the city of Portland. You can find animated maps that show this on our website, show change over time in the growth patterns. Boise is worst. Washington is a little bit better, both Spokane and especially the greater Seattle area. Oregon does better still, but closer to Washington than to the region's leader, which is, again, British Columbia. In Greater Vancouver, 62% of residents live in walkable neighborhoods compared to about 28% in Greater Portland. At the current pace of progress, it'll take about 60 years for Oregon to catch up with British Columbia, unless we can do some things to accelerate the progress. Indicator number 6. I've never done it quite this quickly before. You know, going from 3 years and an 80-page book down to 30 minutes. Whew. Indicator number 6 is forests. Forests are the sort of the defining totemic ecosystem for our place. When people think about the Northwest, they think about forests. Forests also cover about half of the land area, more than any other terrestrial ecosystem. And so as an indicator of generally how we're caring for our natural landscape, forests aren't a bad one. It's difficult to measure ecosystem health. What we're doing for now, and this is sort of a starter step, a starter version of the indicator, is simply looking at forest cover from satellite imagery over the past 30 years. And again, you can see animated maps on our website that show the loss of forest in 5 large sample areas of the Northwest, including 2 in the state of Oregon. Overall in the region, we have a rate of forest loss of about 1 acre a minute as clear-cut spread across old growth and mostly in Oregon, second growth forests. The figure has risen slightly since the year 2000, though it's still far below its peak level from the late 1980s. Indicator number 7 reflects pollution in our region. There are hundreds of kinds of pollution. We think the most important to track, the most revealing indicator or proxy for the larger trends is the most worrisome class of pollutants. These are persistent, bioaccumulative toxins. Persistent because they endure for a long time in the environment without breaking down. Think of DDT. Bioaccumulative, that is, they concentrate up the food chain. The higher you are up the food chain, the higher the concentrations you're going to get in your body. And they're toxic because they have all manner of ill effects from causing cancer, I was going to speak jargon, to causing birth defects, developmental delays and disorders, and all kinds of other bad stuff. We want to measure it. We decided we would measure it in the most intimate environments, the one that ultimately matters most to us, to Northwesterners. That is our own bodies. Not concentrations in the land or the air or the water. And the most convenient and also, I think, most symbolically significant way to measure these concentrations is to measure the concentrations of persistent bioaccumulative toxins in breast milk. We are in the final stages of completing this aspect of the scorecard. We've released results for one of the 3 classes of persistent bioaccumulative toxins that we're studying for the Puget Sound area, and in about 6 weeks we'll release full results, including those for the state of Oregon. What we know from the Washington results is that the concentrations of at least this one class, which is a brominated flame retardant, you're probably, those of you here in the audience, and in fact, folks watching on TV or listening on the radio, if you're sitting on a padded cushion, you're probably sitting on some of these substances, these brominated flame retardants. The concentrations of these in our bodies, at least in the Puget Sound area, are 20 to 40 times as high as in Japan and Europe. The health effects, we believe, are roughly similar to those of PCBs, causing rather dramatic developmental disorders, both cognitive and sexual, among children. Let me summarize then the seven key trends, the trends that we don't hear about in the evening numbers wrap-up on the news. Well, we're not doing too bad in health, economy, population, and even forests. In most of those areas, by world standards, we rack up pretty well. Some of those trends are moving in the right direction, like health. Some of them are flat, like the population indicator. Some of them have recently been moving in the wrong direction, like the forests and economy indicator. But mostly, we're not too far off the benchmarks of the best places in the world. But in energy, sprawl, and pollution, we're doing exceptionally bad. It'll take us 86 years to achieve Germany's level of energy efficiency, 60 years to achieve Vancouver, BC's level of smart growth, and an unknown period, because we haven't been able to track the trend yet on the concentrations of persistent bioaccumulative toxins in our bodies. That's where the story ends. The updates will be coming in all the time. Again, you can go to cascadiascorecard.org and sign up for a monthly email newsletter that's very short and gives you whatever the latest installment, the latest data that we have on any of these indicators, and also to be informed of the annual updates as they come out. If you're very interested, you can actually go on our website and see daily commentary on the different trends that we're providing on a web column there. Not actually updating the numbers, but providing new information as it comes in. I would be remiss to stop leaving you in this state without talking a little bit about what to do, and I will do that in closing with 4 main points and then eagerly await your questions. What do we do? Now, we've got one book called the Cascadia Scorecard that monitors trends at Northwest Environment Watch, and then we have 11 other books that say what to do about it, so I'm going to have to be extremely abbreviated. I'll mention 4 sort of key concepts. On sprawl, the best way I can boil it down is that we need to make our decisions about community planning from the perspective of people who can't drive for whatever reason. Maybe they're, 10-year-old children, or maybe they're seniors. But if we design our community so that you can travel just great on foot, or in a wheelchair, or in a baby stroller, then we will end up making the right choices more often than not. Second, on pollution, we need to begin treating industrial chemicals the way that we treat medicines. The Food and Drug Administration does not allow a new medicine into the marketplace, or a new food additive onto the marketplace, until it has been proven safe, and in the case of medicine, effective. You just can't sell it. It's illegal. But the principle for industrial compounds used in consumer goods is exactly the opposite. You can use anything you can create in the laboratory. You don't have to submit any paperwork to anybody. And as a result, we have a legacy throughout Cascadia of lead in our lead paint on our walls that chips off into the soil, lead leaking into our water supply from old galvanized paint because we assumed lead was safe and went ahead and used it. Just so, we've got asbestos. Tens of millions or even billions of dollars worth of work to do to mitigate the lead and the asbestos and even PCBs that are mostly in old fluorescent lights in our buildings, because we didn't treat industrial compounds like medicine. And we wouldn't today be in a situation where we're finding high concentrations of flame retardants in breast milk in the Northwest if we had simply treated the stuff like medicine. The technical term for this is the precautionary principle, and the common parlance would be you should look before you leap. Point number 3 on energy, though this principle applies more broadly than just to energy, but especially in the case of our high rates of energy consumption. The key concept here is that we need to get prices to tell the ecological truth. The price system is extraordinarily powerful and successful, right? The Cold War is over, the market won, because the price mechanism really works. But that doesn't mean the price system is perfect. There are all kinds of costs of production that get excluded from the bottom line, or get excluded from the ledgers of producers, and therefore excluded from the price. The long-term health effects of brominated flame retardants that thousands of manufacturers have put into their products that's now showing up in breast milk is a perfect example of a cost of producing those goods that isn't reflected in the price. The cost of defending Middle Eastern oil fields is an example of a cost of gasoline that's not included in the price of the fuel. The long-term climate change impacts of burning that gasoline is another example. Now, this is a concept that environmental economists and, in fact, mainstream economists have endorsed now for, gosh, a couple of generations. But we have only in the last decade or so figured out the most powerful way to do that, and that is through the tax system. In Europe now, more than a dozen countries have begun shifting the tax burden off of work, investment, and profit, which is how we raise most revenue in North America, and shifting that burden dollar for dollar in a revenue-neutral way onto the consumption of energy, the depletion of natural resources, the emission of pollution, and to a limited extent, they've even begun exploring how to tax sprawl and traffic congestion. This is a way that we can actually boost economic productivity and well-being at the same time as we reduce energy consumption and pollution. Fourth and finally, the overarching theme, we need to get a lot better at measuring what matters. Because lacking gauges for what we care about, we have fallen back on whatever signals we could find. And we have organized our lives and our institutions to deliver those things that we most measure. To deliver rising stock prices, confident consumers, and the grossest national product we could muster. We have not organized our lives and our institutions to give us the things we most value. Healthy and happy families, strong communities, in a vibrant natural place. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Alan. I'm sorry you had to truncate your comments, but I'm hopeful that our questioners will be able to let you amplify on that. Our question and answer period has arrived, and for those of you who are not aware, it is a privilege of City Club members only to ask the questions and respectfully ask them in a short period of time. Our board host today who will ask the first question is Marcus Simantel. He's a member of the Board of Governors, and he co-chairs the oversight of the issue committees. He's a retired farmer with a long-time history of community activism. Please feel free to line up at either of these two microphones as Marcus begins his comments or question. Thank you.
Thank you, Curleen, and thank you, Alan. You know, in this Cascade Scorecard, which Alan accused me of downloading for free, which I did, and Alan, I'll buy a copy of the book on the way out. Very, very interesting reading if you have not looked at it. And the information, the acknowledgement section is about 30 pages by itself. There's so much good information from so many sources. In the section on sprawl, you stated that sprawl is a choice that people make and it can be kind of decided upon through public policy. And you also, though, point out that Vancouver, BC is the city with the most density, has been most successful at that, and it is surrounded by water and mountains and basically has nowhere to go, so it had no choice but density. And I guess I'd like you to reconcile those two situations, and then also talk a little bit about what policies you might see a metropolitan area make to help with developing more density.
I guess my preemptive thank you didn't really work. He still threw me a zinger. Well, Vancouver is somewhat more constrained geographically than Seattle, and certainly more constrained geographically than Portland. But it is not correct to say that it is completely surrounded by mountains and water and had nowhere to go. It could have sprawled to the U.S. border, which is quite a ways. It could have sprawled up the Fraser River Valley, which, like the Willamette Valley, is extraordinarily rich farmland. It is, in fact, the most fertile farmland in Western Canada, which isn't saying very much. This is mostly mountains. But they take pride in that. Like Oregon, and more so than in Washington, the dynamics are similar, that the farmland is concentrated in the same place that the land most desirable for real estate development is. The key differences between Vancouver and the Northwest states in terms of growth management or smart growth is not the geography. The key differences are, well, do I want to say two? I'll say two. Okay, then there are some other things under this that also matter. But the two most important are Canada has no interstate freeway system. There are some provincial highway systems, but there was never the kind of massive investment that we had in the United States where the federal government was paying 90% of the cost and localities just had to come up with another 10% to put freeways wherever they wanted. So there was, in fact, a proposal in Vancouver to build some freeways because they saw what was going on south of the border, but it was a local proposal, it would have been locally funded. The city planning commissions from Vancouver actually came down to Seattle to see I-5 being built, and they went back, fled in horror, and said never again. There was actually a plan of how Vancouver was going to have, you know, as many lane miles of urban freeway as Seattle or Portland, and they didn't do that. As a consequence, you travel on surface streets just about everywhere in Greater Vancouver, and that has the effect of raising land values everywhere within the metropolitan area. In transportation, time is the most important currency. A freeway system dramatically reduces the time when the freeway isn't congested, which seems to be when people make their real estate choices, right? They don't go looking at houses during rush hour, which is, of course, what they should do, right? People go looking for houses when the traffic is less, and they think, oh, it's easy to get from there to there, right? In Vancouver, it takes the same amount of time whenever, right? The argument is that some folks make is, well, Vancouver ends up being more congested because they don't have the freeway system. But I would argue that to the contrary, and most of the evidence supports my side, which is that the congestion, there is congestion in Vancouver, but it's certainly no worse, and it's more manageable because it's more diffuse across the street grid than in Portland or Seattle, where it's all concentrated on the choke points of the freeway system. The second really important factor that has made a difference between British Columbia or Greater Vancouver and Washington and Oregon and Idaho is that in 1973, the same year that Oregon passed its first in the nation growth management law, British Columbia passed a similarly pioneering piece of legislation, but it took a different, almost the opposite approach. It may sound like a fine point, but it turns out to have a huge implications. The Oregon Growth Management System, which most U.S. states have copied, is based on the idea that you draw a circle and you grow inside that circle until you filled it up, and then you expand the circle, right? It's not an iron wall. It's a temporary line, right? We'll fill this space and then we'll move out. In British Columbia, what happened in 1973 was the creation of an agricultural land reserve. It was not built as an urban containment or an anti-sprawl thing at all. What they did was they set aside all Class 1 and Class 2 farmland in the province permanently for agricultural production. Now, they knew, of course, that most of it was clustered right around Vancouver. So they did build, right, a boundary to the south and to the east of the city of Greater Vancouver that works almost that is almost as effective as putting a mountain range and extending the ocean into that area. There's tremendous sort of political and popular support for the land reserve. It's become sort of sacred space, right? So there's, I think, a big psychological difference between drawing a line and saying, well, this is where we're going to grow first, and then later we'll take over some other land. What puts the focus on the city part. And the Canadian system, or the British Columbian system, where they've said, these are the lands where there's never going to be development, right? They've expanded on the land reserve with some open space, protected open space as well. I've talked enough about that. Let's take a question.
My name is Greg Raisman. I'm a City Club member. And I recently just heard that San Francisco has implemented the precautionary principle. First of all, I guess, is that true? If it is, how is it performing in terms of cost, and what type of pressure has there been associated with that purchasing policy of the precautionary principle in terms of service provision and levels of service and things like that?
It's true that the city council in San Francisco adopted the precautionary principle, but I don't think they have any idea what, they just kind of said, okay, we subscribe to this now. I don't think they've really figured out all how you operationalize that as a city government, right? This is a principle that needs to be implemented in many different institutions, in the private sector, in the public sector. Ultimately, it needs to be national law. Just as the organic law that creates the Food and Drug Administration establishes those principles. A city council can do it and try to implement it in, their procurement policies or their contracting policies or something, but it's a fairly small leverage point. And so, therefore, because it hasn't made much difference, the cost has been very small. But there's a proposal in Seattle to adopt it there too, and the city council was like, well, what would that mean for us? That's next one over here.
I'm Ron Cease. I'm a member of the City Club, and as a former state legislator who chaired environmental committees in both the House and the Senate, I'm interested particularly in your remarks on where you would put water, and secondly, your relationship between health and the pollution side. You say health is in good shape, going up, and yet you talk about pollution, particularly as it affects the body, and they don't seem to relate to me in reference to your remarks.
Mm-hmm. Good questions. Where would I put water? I like to drink it, bathe in it. I assume you mean where would I put water in terms of the importance of water as a concern. The process of creating the scorecard was fascinating and challenging. We wanted to get to a small enough set of indicators that we can communicate and people can understand it fairly easily. So we had to we had to make some very difficult choices. Among environmental issues, water is a much bigger deal than it deserves a lot more attention than it gets. But there's no single indicator that we could come up with that would reflect the variety of water concerns with water quality, water quantity, and the ecological health of our aquatic ecosystems, which is to some extent a different concern and in some ways the largest problem that we face. On the second question, there are many, many different determinants of human health. And what we're seeing now is that other factors are improving health while pollution levels are degrading health. We have seen during a period, as another example, we've seen during the period when lifespan continues to increase in the region, obesity rising to near epidemic proportions. That is to say, we have well over a third of adults are, according to the body mass index, obese. But that also hasn't had the effect of actually decreasing lifespan. What both are doing is slowing the rate of improvement. And maybe one reason why, for example, lifespans in British Columbia are substantially higher, that is 2 years higher than in the Northwest states. Obesity is 1/3 less common in British Columbia, in part because of compact cities where people walk a lot more. And why Japan, which has 1/40th the concentrations of persistent bioaccumulative toxins in breast milk, why Japan is the world's health leader. Which isn't to say that Japan couldn't be better, but Japan is the longest lifespan in the world. There are just a lot of things that ultimately manifest themselves in health.
You got the same thing as saying you're going to live longer, but you're going to feel like hell getting there?
That's a good question. And some folks, this is the typical critique of the lifespan indicator is, well, you're just measuring extraordinary medical interventions that keep people alive longer at the end of life. But the specialists who study this have shown that that lifespan is closely correlated with quality of life during those years as well. That health actually, and in fact, increases in lifespan may understate improvements in health that we're experiencing. Lifespan has been increasing even while we've had a rising, essentially a crisis of uninsurance and access to medical care. So again, many things we can do to improve health, but compared to other places in the world, we're not doing so bad. Please. Oh wait, sorry. Ray.
Ray Polani, a City Club member. I will concentrate primarily on two of your indicators, sprawl and energy.
I'm going to concentrate on those two also.
It seems to me that since most of our population is urbanized in Cascadia, we should insist and clarify the connection between urban form, being its sprawl versus compactness, and the use of the automobile. And also, of course, the insufficiency of the alternative, which is public transportation. My question for you is, how can we reverse this trend? How can we increase public transportation, specifically the funding of public transportation, in order to affect the two other indicators?
I'm not an expert on how to increase the funding for anything. Maybe I should ask Park Burgess, who's our fundraiser, to come up and tell about that, or maybe the former legislator who is here could talk about that. Let me say this about it, Ray. What we found in the central area of the city of Vancouver is that the actual total number of trips made by private car is now decreasing, okay? Not per person, but total, okay? The central area of Vancouver has had a huge increase in population, right? Think of the Pearl District times 20, right? Tall skyscraper condominiums, thousands and thousands of people moving in, and the total number of car trips is decreasing. Now, what's happening is that they've gone over a threshold where walking and rollerblading and biking is just a lot more convenient because everything's so close together, plus it's fun and there's people on the streets, and why wouldn't you want to be out, right? Getting in a car is possible. There's still relatively high rates of car ownership, but people use their cars a lot less. That should be, I think, our goal, not to vilify the motor vehicle, which of course is a useful tool, but to encase it in urban forms where people have many choices for most trips. There are some trips where always the motor vehicle. Now, the same kinds of things have led to huge increases in transit ridership in the central area of Vancouver, right? So there is a yin-yang relationship between transportation policy and land use policy. Land use decisions that affect where the population is concentrated print out as transportation patterns, and transportation investments can shape where the population concentrates. I would argue that the most important lessons we can take from the leader in our region, British Columbia, is starve the roads, right? And concentrate as much growth as possible around the downtown core. The single-family neighborhoods in Vancouver, just like those in Portland, don't want a lot of infill growth and all that stuff. But they're concentrating a lot of it right around the core, and that seems to be what's making a big difference.
We have time for just one more question, unless you wanted to go for 2 or 3 minutes extra, but we have time for just one more.
We have time for one more.
I will be brief. Tom Cox, I'm I guess the token Libertarian City Club member. I'm also a candidate for state representative. I was very excited to hear you cite markets and price mechanisms as drivers of social and economic change. But I was a little drawn up short when you cited taxes as the way to get long-term costs factored into prices rather than, say, private insurance and property rights. Is that just a policy preference of yours, or could you remark on that?
No, it's not just a policy preference. I'm right.
Good to know.
Okay. Next question. No. When we did, well, it's an interesting question, and in our book from 2001 called "This Place in Our 2001 Guide to a Sustainable Northwest," there are some cases that we identify where legalizing markets or creating quasi property rights does look like a big opportunity. Some examples that we gave were some different shading of how water rights are interpreted, so that it, in fact, wouldn't be a full privatization, but it would make water rights for farmers and ranchers transferable, thus creating a market for them. And this we believe would let the price tell the truth, just as taxing pollution and resource depletion would. So there are a number of ways to make prices tell the truth, in addition to tax policy. In the areas that show the need for the greatest improvement, that is energy and sprawl, privatization or creating markets doesn't seem like it holds anywhere near as much potential. And let me say, as final comment on that, our work on tax shifting, which you can find the fullest exposition of in a book we did in 1998 called Tax Shift, and again you can download the entire thing off our website for free, or there is a market for the book, was reviewed and praised in the press by a number of libertarian research centers, including, at least in part, the Cascade Policy Institute's John Charles.
Thank you.
All right?
Alan, thank you very much. Interesting presentation and a lot to strive for. In any case, we will be here next Friday for the domestic violence program, and I look forward to seeing you then. We're adjourned.